Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly, and we're back with episode 3 of Nymphing Essentials with Jason Randall. How are you, Jason?
I'm doing great, Marvin. Thanks. Spent the day fishing with Mac Brown, and boy, it's been a great day.
That's awesome. And, folks, episode 3, we're going to talk about detecting the strike. We've already talked about getting in the zone and getting the drift, but this time we're going to spend all of our time on detecting the strike. And, I guess, Jason, the best place to start is, why do most anglers miss fish?
Well, I think if you look at the first illustration that we put in for tonight's episode, you can see that when we use suspension devices, which is a default for many of us nymph anglers, there is an inherent delay that's built into those as far as when the fish picks up the fly from when we register the strike. And we want to blame ourselves and say, wow, maybe I'm not good at this. But in reality, it's a faulty system. There is a delay, and that causes us to miss fish.
Yeah, and that really happens even if you don't use weight, right? Because there's that little strip of water at the top of the water column that's moving faster than the water at the surface, right?
That's right. And that creates a lot of subsurface slack between our strike indicator and our flies. And we think that when we're fishing with a suspension device, if we mend and there's no drag between us and the strike indicator, meaning that there's no drag that we can see, that we have a perfect drift and that we're going to register those strikes. But in reality, as you look at either the illustration that we put up for tonight or the photos from prior episodes, if you look at those, you know that not only is our drift not as good, we're not reaching goals 1 and 2, but that slack that we see subsurface between our strike indicator and our flies is creating our missed strikes. It's really the fault of the system.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I know a lot of people sometimes will try to compensate by using more weight, and that actually makes the problem even worse.
Well, it can. I mean, more weight is not always the answer. Balancing the rig, we talked about a little bit prior, but having a small suspension device, a small suspension device that will float our flies, and then balancing it with the right amount of weight so that we stay in the strike zone, reaching goals 1 and 2. But also, by doing so, we eliminate some of that slack that creates the problem in reaching goal 3, which is strike detection. So the more connected we are to our flies, the better our strike detection will be.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I shared this story with you before, but I usually will go fish with my boys. We kind of have a standing fishing date between Christmas and New Year's, and I can remember watching my oldest son fish, and the water was really clear, and we were fishing kind of junk flies, so they were easy to see. And I can remember literally watching the trout eat and spit out an egg about a half a dozen times, and the indicator never moved.
Yep, and that happens a lot. The fault is in the system. It's a faulty system, but now that we know that this is a problem, then the fault goes to us. It's so far we've been led astray by an inaccurate system, but now it becomes our fault because now we know about the problem, and then we have solutions that we can fix.
Yeah. Do you believe in a sixth sense?
I used to, but I think really more and more I believe in the powers of observation and trusting yourself. Knowing that little movement that is registered in our strike detection method, whatever it is, what we're using, could be a fish. And I think that one of the guides that I began fishing with probably 25 years ago, and I learned a lot from him. He told me hook sets are free. And if you think that it could have been the bottom or it might have been a fish, go ahead and set that hook. And if it's not a fish, well, then it's simply the beginning of a new cast. And hook sets are free, set the hook. And so I think in the evolution of becoming a more complete nymph angler, I think it's learning to trust yourself and going ahead and setting that hook. And if it's not a fish, that's okay. There's a lot of times where I'm nymph fishing and I don't get through 3 out of 4 drifts without setting the hook, because that could have been a fish. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But if it's not a fish, it's simply the beginning of a new cast.
Yeah, and I think the great thing too, particularly fishing barbless flies, is you really don't need a lot to set the hook. And so, like for me, I just think about I start lifting, and if I feel tension, I keep lifting, right? But if you don't, you can just put your flies back.
That's right. That's right. And a lot of times the hook set is relevant to where it occurs during that drift. If a presumed strike occurs when the fly or the drift is still upstream of my position, a simple lift is all you need to do to set that hook. But if the strike should occur below my position and the drift is already passed downstream of me, a lift might end up pulling that fly out of the fish's mouth. And so my hook set from a downstream position, when I am above the fish and the strike would occur downstream of me, would be usually a horizontal sweep over my shoulder rather than lifting directly, because I think I'd get more fish hooked up that way.
Yeah, got it. And so, we've identified the problem. What are your suggestions for improving strike detection?
Well, I think depending on the method that you're using, I think when the opportunity presents itself, using some type of a tight line, Euro nymphing style of nymph fishing is probably allows the greatest connectivity to our flies, minimizing subsurface slack, and I think that gives us the most accurate and sensitive strike detection. When we're going to use alternative methods, and again, it's the water that tells us when we need to use one method over another. But when I'm using a long-range nymphing method where I cannot use a Euro nymphing or a tight line type of nymphing, I think balancing that rig using the smallest strike detector that will float my flies and enough weight to reach goals 1 and 2 of contact with the strike zone, I think those tend to be more sensitive and more subtle as far as picking up and registering those strikes that are softer. And I like yarn indicators that are have a small footprint in the water, and I think those can really register those subtle and softer strikes.
Yeah, and we talked too before that there also, there's certainly a way that like New Zealand yarn indicators float when you've got a good drift. But like I know Dave Whitlock designed an indicator. There are quite a few that almost have
Mm-hmm.
a needle, right? That kind of tells you
Yep.
where your flies are, right?
Right. Dave Whitlock's is a telestrike, and it's a very good indicator. I think there's a lot of good commercial indicators available. New Zealand is certainly one of them. If I'm going to use a plastic, I like airlocks. I think they're a lot more adjustable, and we make those adjustments based on water type and depth. And I think if you have an indicator system that's more adjustable, you will make more adjustments based on the circumstances you face. And I think those are all really, really good choices. I think again, having something that is small enough and sensitive enough to register the subtle strikes vary greatly based on the water. In fast moving water, that trout is going to just stick his nose out from under cover or up into the current, grab that fly and duck. And those strikes tend to be a lot more abrupt and a lot more obvious. It's the subtle strikes in slower moving water that are hard to register, because that trout can just kind of drift with the fly and kind of suck that fly in by flaring the gills, and they can eject it just as fast by coughing it out. Those are the strikes that are harder to detect, and that's where we really need the most subtle or the most sensitive strike detection method. And I think that's where the yarns and the New Zealand style indicators really excel.
Yeah. And Jason, what are your thoughts on like drop shot rigs, right? Where you're basically, putting chains of split shot at the bottom of your rig to kind of tighten things out under the indicator.
Well, there's a time and place for most of these techniques, and drop shotting can be super effective. It definitely reaches goals 1 and 2, and it reaches a strike zone, and I think you can get a good drift with it. But when we add mass to our rig like that, I think we dull the sensitivity of that as well. So if I'm looking for a little more finesse, then drop shotting would certainly not be where I would turn.
Yeah, got it. And we talked about hook sets are free. We talked about kind of how we would set the hook with the fly being upstream of our position, and how we would set the hook if the fly was downstream of our position. Anything else you want to kind of share with folks on kind of setting the hook once you detect the strike?
Sure. I think there's a really an underappreciated value to playing fish as well, keeping the fish as short as possible. Not just holding the rod in a high rod position and letting that fish tumble downstream and getting ahead of it. I think trying to master the fight is often underappreciated. Get control of that fish. I like to keep that fish. I like to steer the fish and keep him on a relatively short leash while I play him. I like to stay abreast of the fish. I don't like the fish to go well upstream or well downstream of where I am. I tend to try to follow the fish. If it's a big fish and he's going downstream, try to keep him as short as possible and try to stay abreast of the fish. And then as you steer that fish towards the net, I think, again, that's something we want to make sure as anglers we have control of that and not letting the fish dictate the fight, trying to be in charge.
Got it. And so, are you a big fan of side pressure?
I am. I am. I think when we hold that rod straight over our head and straight upright, that's kind of neutral. And if we're trying to direct that fish by holding that rod horizontal, I think we have more influence in the fight. And I think we can take control of that and keep the fish where we want them, and then guide the fish and steer the fish into a position where it's easier for us to net them. We don't want to net that fish necessarily in fast water. We want to try to get him to the point where we're not fighting the fish and the current together when we're trying to net him.
Yeah, I think, too, I think, folks, what we're really saying too is you get the ability to bend the rod really deep down the blank to the handle.
Oh
And,
yeah.
and you're still protecting the tippet, but you're able to put a lot more pressure than if you basically have the tip high and you just have the tip of the rod bent maintaining tension.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Marvin. I think, the spine is where we play the fish. The tip is what protects the fish. And so getting that fish into the flex of the rod into the lower part of the rod is going to bring that fish to net quicker, and it's going to be easier on the fish as well. We're not going to fight that fish to exhaustion to the point where he's depleted and can't recharge once we release him.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing else I can think of is, not to change direction unnecessarily, because you're just basically making the hole that the hook is in looser and looser, right?
That's right. Yep. And the barbless hooks, I'm a big believer in barbless hooks, but you're going to lose a few fish, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I'm really okay with that because I think it is easier on the fish, and trying to play the fish to net quicker without exhausting that fish is just another sign of respect for the trout that we try to catch.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, we love questions. And remember the promotion that we're doing. If you send questions to us and DM me on Instagram, that's the easiest way. I'm keeping track of all the questions. And everyone that submits a question will be entered in a drawing for a signed copy of Jason's book, Nymph Masters. And then we're going to select a handful of the best questions. And those are going to be in our final Q&A episode. And those folks will be entered in a drawing for a TFO stealth rod and reel combo loaded with an SA Euro nymphing line. So super cool. Send us your questions. We've gotten a ton of questions. And also, Jason, we definitely want to thank our friends at TFO and SA for supporting us in this.
Absolutely, and we can't say enough about that. These are great companies that invest a lot in education in our sport, and really innovative companies that are working hard to bring new products and good products to our sport, and I think that really is a point to be emphasized.
Absolutely. And folks, we're pretty much everywhere in the United States now, at least feels like spring for most people. And you owe it to yourself to get out there and practice some of the things we've been talking about and go out there and catch a few. Tight lines, everybody. Tight lines, Jason.
Thank you.